So I'm going to just have a little introduction. I'm a law professor, so I have to give you the outline. I'm going to talk about some deep decarbonization projects that are going on throughout the world, and then how my project relates to those. Then specifically what I'm trying to look at, and our project is looking at, is what legal impediments are there at different phases. So mine is specifically at distributed generation. So some of the legal roadblocks that have come up for that, and then some solutions for that. So for those of you who are out in the field and know of things that, you know, I don't mention and think I should mention, I'd love for you to tell me about that. And then these blocks that I have found, you know, any feedback on those, I'm always interested in that. And then we'll bring it together. So some of you have maybe already seen this slide. This is the Easter Parade in New York City in 1911. Can anybody point out where the car is? There's mostly horses there. Yeah. Okay, who's found it yet? Anybody? Okay, so I see one over there. Everybody. Okay, I won't make... Well, actually, I circled it, okay? So it's there. There's one car that you can see in that picture. And I've seen different people give this picture, but where I found it on the internet, it said 1911. So I don't know, some people have said it's longer. Here's the New York Easter Parade in 1913. Now, I don't know if that just happened in 2 years, but, you know, obviously there was a big change there because you can't find the horse anymore. It's all pretty much cars. So it just dramatically shows this disruptive technology, basically, that we displaced horses with the horseless carriage. But unfortunately, you know, shifting from horses that are organic and their waste is organic and all that good stuff to horseless carriages, that contributed to our CO2 emissions. So, you know, all these things that we've seen as progress have their price, right? And so we've noticed that CO2 is the problem with that. So many of you know what happened in Paris in December of 2015. Some of the things that came out of it are that every single nation that's part of the United Nations agreed to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade. So as McKibben said, we don't know if that's going to be above the pre-industrial levels. We don't know if that will fix everything, but we're hoping that that will prevent, you know, or at least let us go back and sort of correct some of the problems we've already seen. That what we're going to do for the second half of this century is try to balance inputs with reductions, because we're not going to stop completely emitting CO2, but at least if we can get a net zero greenhouse gas emissions, we're hoping that that will keep things in line. Each country set some near-term targets, and from what I understand, the ones that President Obama set, you know, for 20 to 2021 won't be changed by anything that Trump does. It's the problem is for the next part. So every 5 years you have to look at those targets again. And so the countries all said that by 2020 they would develop these mid-century long-term greenhouse gas emission development strategies. Well, wisely, the United States, the Obama administration figured that this wasn't going to happen if they didn't do it before they left. So in November of 2016, the United States already issued its mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that deep decarbonization project. Then I'm going to talk to you, this is the UN deep decarbonization project. Actually, a nonprofit working with the UN had done one. And then the book that I'm working on is called Legal Pathways, right? Because we have people that are looking at big picture, people that are looking at the technology, people that look at different countries, what they can do, and then what our project is trying to look at, you know, each solution and figure out what the legal strategies would be to get to that. So this is the first study that I mentioned. This is the one that the Obama administration put together before he left office. And one of the things that he points out is that, you know, since 2008, the gross domestic product has increased over 10%, while energy and CO2 actually decreased more than 9%. So a lot of people have complained that, you know, you're stifling the economy if you cut back on CO2 emissions, but, you know, the Obama administration proved that that wasn't necessarily true. California's been doing this for a long time. So there is this split now that you don't have to keep generating more CO2 to have economic development. So this lays out the strategy to try to get it to 2050. Again, that's the mid-century goal. These are the three pillars of the United States strategy. One is to transform a low-carbon energy system, so, you know, doubling clean energy, things like that, scaling up targeted support, economic workforce development for Americans with low-carbon energy transition. The second pillar is sequestering carbon through forest, soils, and CO2 removal technology. So I know that Ron Larson will be telling them more about biochar for that pillar. Yep. And then reduce non-CO2 emissions. So those are things like methane. And if you haven't already called Senator Cory Gardner to say don't get rid of the methane rule on public lands, call him up tonight or tomorrow or whatever. They still haven't voted on that one. They have gotten rid, I don't know if you've been following, there is something called the Congressional Review Act, where Congress had never used it once before to get rid of regulations that were in place. The Obama administration had done a lot of the climate control, you know, legislation through regulation because Congress wasn't on board with this, right? So that makes it vulnerable to Congress being able to use this act to try to reverse some of that regulation that wasn't passed long ago. Okay, so it was like 60 days after January 15th they had, and it's 60 legislative days, so we all know they've been on a lot of vacations. So that period has not completely passed yet. So they already used the Congressional Review Act to get rid of the Waters of the United States rule, which was preventing some of the mountaintop mine removal from those wastes going into streams. So unfortunately, decades of work, you know, to try to get that rule in place has been eliminated by Congress using the Congressional Review Act to get rid of those regulations. They could do the same thing with the methane rules. And the methane rules right now that are possibly on the chopping block are to, you know, require companies that are drilling for natural gas on public lands to capture that methane and to not just let it go into the atmosphere or not to burn it. So many of you have probably seen that picture of North Dakota that has that great big light up in the middle of nowhere. People thought it was another Chicago. And it was just they were burning off the methane because it wasn't worth it for them to try to pipe that anywhere. So they're just wasting it and putting it into the atmosphere. So all the people that would get royalties on that methane aren't getting anything for it. So those regulations that Cory Gardner may vote to get rid of would prevent us from getting on public lands any of those royalties on our methane, keep them from capturing that methane. So hopefully that rule will survive, we'll just see. But that's what we're talking about as far as some of the non-CO2 rules. And I don't want to get, is there any other lawyer? Well, I know there's somebody with a law degree in the audience because I recognize at least one, but anybody, I don't want to be too wonky, so if I'm getting too lawyer, let me know. But I think that it's just helpful for you all to understand how some of these things work. And the good news is that we do have, though, a system of government that requires that even if Congress doesn't like some of the older rules that came in less than the last 60 days, because there's a lot of midnight rules they talk about, one administration's leaving. This has just happened for many administrations. Right before one administration leaves, they pass all these regulations so the next administration doesn't like it, and there's now this Congressional Review Act for getting rid of those. But ones that they've been through the comment, and they've been through the review periods, and they've been on the books, it's going to be much harder to get rid of those rules. So that's some solace for us. They can't just change those rules. They have to have some scientific basis for us. The court systems are going to uphold, you know, most of those rules if they, you know, have some scientific basis, which they obviously did. So that's something. So I got a little off there. If people have other questions about that, I'll help with that. So this is the Obama Deep Decarbonization Report. They set out advanced technologies with no additional policy and then some pathways with policy as well. So again, technology may help us with some of this. We've at least gotten some of the inertia going in the right direction that can't be immediately reversed. But without some of these other policies, we're not going to reach the goals that we hope and the reductions. And you see, too, that, we have been going down. We had the recession, of course, which caused a dramatic drop in almost everything, the price of oil and the use of energy and everything. But even when we've been coming back in the Obama years, we weren't reaching the emissions that we were before 2009. Okay, so that was the Obama administration deep decarbonization study. This one is with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is part of the United Nations. Ban Ki-moon put this group together in 2012. And then the Institute de Développement Durable et de Relations International, my French is terrible, but basically that's a nonprofit that studies and tries to give solutions and so forth, right? So these groups have come together, and it's a collaborative global initiative to try to deal with decarbonization, which means getting carbon out of our system as much as we can. 16 independent research teams, and that means they're independent from their governments, so their governments don't necessarily agree with whatever solutions they've come up with, but they are scientific research groups. They represent 75% of global CO2 emissions. And starting in the fall of 2013, they started to put together roadmaps or pathways for every country. So this is the one that was first issued for the United States. It's Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States, and then Policy Implications of Deep Decarbonization in the United States. Those were in November of 2015, and then in December of 2015, this group put together the whole world, okay? So that at the time of the Paris Accord, there were already roadmaps for everybody. So we could say, this is achievable, right? These are things that can be done. So it's important, I think, that we have these groups coming together and saying, here's how we're going to try to do this. This is doable. Let's all sign up to try to do our best to do it. So our project focuses more on this policy part because, again, we're the people, the lawyers are the people that are trying to take the technology and put it into something that's actually practice, right? That the states or the federal government will deal with. So here are a few things from that study. This is, I think, interesting. The yellow line is what the annual energy outlook from Energy Information Administration, and I always put these URLs, and I think that the slideshow is put on the web. So if anybody wants to follow up on these sources, I always like to give you that option. But the U.S. Government Energy Information Administration, if you didn't already know it, makes projections. So in 1996, this is what they projected for the price of oil, and you can see how erratic the price of oil has been in comparison to that projection. Similarly, this was their projection for the price of natural gas. And again, it's been, it was close for a while, and then it's gone. This dip is the 2009 economic crisis. But in general, they've been way off on what that price will be, right? In comparison, the yellow line is what they predicted for electricity, and actually electricity prices have been, the actual price has been lower than what they projected. So one of the things that a lot of people is a good selling point for renewable energy is that you don't have this volatility of prices that you're going to have inevitably with oil or natural gas because of the world market and the OPEC and other countries, demanding those resources. And then this is the, this study's, I call it the DDPP, the Deep Decarbonization Project. They're saying that we're going to, right now in 2014, we had, you can see, pretty heavy petroleum use for transportation. This is natural gas used for electricity generation and for industry. This gray one is coal. That when we, with the strategies that they're talking about for 2050, we don't have coal at all in the mix. Look how little petroleum has become. They still have some gas in there, but basically we're moving, here are their three strategies: moving to higher efficiency, obviously, at the end use for either transportation, buildings, industry; decarbonization of electricity, so trying to move to sources that don't burn fossil fuels; and then electrification of things like transportation. That's going to be a really key step to decarbonizing our economy, because about half of our energy right now the energy system is split so that about half of it is for transportation, and that's oil, petroleum, and then the other half is for electricity, and that uses a number of different sources, and most renewables are used for electricity. So a lot of people argue, well, I don't want to get an electric car, probably nobody in this audience because we have electric cars, but that if you are charging your electric car with fossil fuels, then it's still probably a benefit, but it's not as good as if you could charge it with renewables. So eventually you want to get, electric cars with renewable energy or non-carbon energy sources. Okay, so then this is the third, I talked about, first the Obama administration deep decarbonization study, the UN nonprofit group, and then this is what my group is doing with a number of professors all over the United States, that we're looking at legal pathways, and here are some of the things that they're looking at: carbon pricing, human behavior, lighting, buildings, light-duty vehicles. These are all the chapters. This book is supposed to come out in early 2018. And my chapter is focusing specifically on distributed generation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that I'd like your input on. But, they're looking at aviation, shipping, nuclear energy. So far, the Obama administration study did have nuclear as part of the mix. So, again, does anybody know what this picture is of?
You have to walk no more than 4 miles an hour in front of it, warning people of it.
Right. So yeah, there were electric cars at the beginning of time. That one could be an electric car. But this was called the red flag rule. Okay, so this is just an example. I'm trying to show you that we had vehicles at the beginning, we're going to have vehicles at in middle here, but why the law matters and how the law can get in the way of a new technology. So with the red flag rule, they said, well, the horse interest didn't like automobiles disturbing the horses, right? And so they passed laws early on that said you have to have someone walking ahead of any automobile, and you can't go more than 4 miles an hour. So here's sort of a timeline of some of the laws about automobiles. This is, I think, from Britain, but Highway Act prohibits riding on footpaths, introduced dangerous driving. Then in 1865, there was the Locomotion Act, which was called the Red Flag Act. It restricted the speed of horseless vehicles to 4 miles an hour in open country, 2 miles an hour in town, required 3 drivers for each vehicle, 2 to travel in the vehicle and 1 to walk ahead carrying a flag. So that was the Red Flag Act. So you can see how, the law and society has to learn to deal with these new technologies. And actually cars were considered sort of evil in many ways. I don't know if you remember in Great Gatsby, this is a picture of, Daisy killed Myrtle, I think, yeah. And that was about, sort of the rich people were using these vehicles, and they weren't being careful of people's lives, and there weren't clear rules about what to do. So in 1875, 1,589 people were killed in road accidents, right? So, because they didn't have any rules of the road. No one had thought about it before that, Detroit claims that they were one of the first places to have lanes and to have pedestrian crossings and things like that. But at first there weren't any rules. So, for a couple of decades, they had this Red Flag Act, and finally in 1896, they repealed that, and the car was beginning to take over from the horses, right? But here you have another person, walking in front of the car. And as I said, without that, you had these huge traffic jams in cities because no one knew, you didn't have stop signs, you didn't have rules of the road. And in fact, they said in Detroit it was more troublesome because back east where people had cars, everybody had a chauffeur, so they had certain, rules among chauffeurs about what to do. But when you had the average person driving in a car, then it was more chaotic and they had to figure out these rules. So that's why Detroit got to be sort of the head of the game for the rules. But I'm using these as illustrations to show how the law can hold us back, but how it's also necessary to kind of integrate something that's a new concept. So I feel that we are right now, with respect to distributed renewable energy, at the pushback stage in a lot of instances, right? So I'm going to talk about net zero carbon buildings, electricity, solar PV and storage as the next killer app, as one person has described it, and then distributed thermal resources. So I picked these basically, and this is a very rough rule of thumb. I'm going to show you a more scientific graph, but to just show that at least generally, some people say about a quarter of the home's use is electricity plug load, about a quarter is domestic hot water, and about a half space heating. And so I focused on my chapter, and you're getting your feedback on using solar PV and storage to address that plug load, and then DG thermal applications like hot water and space conditioning. I'll talk about a few options for that. And then why didn't I talk about distributed wind as a possible source for electricity in the homes? Mainly because, at least so far, here's some vertical axis wind turbines, but so far no one's found that that's been very reliable source or, economically reasonable. So it might come around that they are, but at least so far I've not seen that as a major source. So a lot of people, when they talk about renewables in the mix for industrial scale, wind is actually, if you looked back at that chart where I had the different lines, wind was way up there as one of the main renewable sources. And we're getting bigger and bigger turbines, so the little distributed ones, there are a lot of things blocking them and a lot of different issues still. Also, how many people have heard of in-pipe hydro? Yeah, good audience. I love this audience. I come here to learn from you and then hopefully share it with others. But yes, Portland is doing an experiment with this. Basically, they're trying to, you could do it in a number of places, but anywhere you have plumbing, you could add some of these turbines that can be used, and that would be a good renewable resource that has the dispatchability, they say, when maybe the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. So it would create a nice backup source if it is more widely adopted, but it isn't yet. So these two, I'm mainly focusing right now on solar and storage, the next killer app. And Martin mentioned that, we were on National Public Radio just last week, anyway. And this was one of the pictures that Grace Hood, the energy and environmental reporter, took of our garage, because we do have solar PV and we have some of the old marine battery storage. So, and of course our plug-in car. So solar has a lot of potential. The US solar capacity tripled to 32 gigawatts at the end of 2016, up from 10 in just 2013. So, it's moving fast. As we talked in the video before, they talked about how the price had dropped so significantly. But there's also technical potential for rooftop solar PV of 1,118 gigawatts, which we're only about 1% of that so far. So there's, the National Renewable Energy Lab has done a study about the rooftop potential and said, hey, we haven't even begun to use it. And I know you hear it a lot from community solar people, and I do mention community in my chapter. I don't talk about it tonight, but there's always this stuff about only 20% of rooftop area is optimal for PV. That doesn't mean 26% of people, it means 26% of rooftop area. But even with that, NREL found that had the greatest potential, because there's so many small buildings that there's still a lot of space. This always happens. Okay, so solar and storage have a great combination, are a great combination. And you may have seen this graphic from the Rocky Mountain Institute. They talk about what can batteries do to, help with solar, and there are just so many different things that batteries do to help, and they help utilities, they help the ISOs or the RTOs, those are the regional transmission organizations, and then customers get different benefits, right? So for the utility, they can allow them to put off building more transmission lines because they're using more distributed energy in the local neighborhoods. They can also defer sometimes distribution. I know Xcel's talking about building up some of its distribution to deal with more solar on the system. But in some situations, depending on where the need is, and that's one of the ways they figure out whether you should be interconnected, like Hawaii, they're trying to encourage people to connect where they don't need to build more wires, but in other places they're discouraging people from connecting if that means that the infrastructure is not there already. It can prevent congestion relief and resource adequacy. For the transmissions, they can actually provide voltage support, frequency regulation, so they're just providing more. Somebody said the beauty of the battery is that it takes in energy when you have too much, and then it can take energy out. So it's both a generation source and a source for use, right? So when the system's generating, if you have too much solar energy, a lot of people here have probably heard of that duck curve in California where they're worrying about at the middle of the day when solar is just going to town, they may not have enough demand to take up all that solar. Right now, when everybody's got their air conditioners on, you definitely need all that solar, so it's very valuable. But if you put too much solar energy on, you could potentially have too much. Well, if you have batteries to back it up, then you're not going to have a problem with that. So that helps with that regulation. And for customers, it can avoid demand charges. And so that's one of the things that actually Grace Hood was coming to interview us about, but I don't think it came out too much in the story, was that one of the things that Xcel's doing is it has some pilot programs for different rates. And right now, most of us are just paying a flat rate. And my contention is that the flat rate really teaches you bad habits, right? Because in reality, it costs a lot more for Xcel to get electricity at the peak time in the summer when everyone's air conditioner is on, because it's like Uber, what are you young people, surge pricing? Yes, those of us who haven't used Uber, but apparently, if there are a lot of people out at the baseball game or whatever, and they're all calling for Uber rides, then the price goes up. And so they recognize that. And that's what happens with electricity. It costs Xcel a lot more to get the electricity during that peak time. But if they're not charging you for it, then customers aren't going to change their behavior. So, we've signed up for a time of use pilot project. It shouldn't hurt us because we're actually generating power probably during the time that most people aren't. But if, in general, if people became more aware, then you can use your batteries to manage your time of use so that if you do have to turn something on during that peak time, you're not paying a higher rate. And California, other places have mandatory time of use rates. So I was talking about solar plus storage, and this is the part where, again, if I'm being too lawyer-like, you can, fall asleep. No, you can't fall asleep. But you can tell me, here are some of the things that I tried to work out. And when we started this book, it was before the election. So we had all these great plans to try to do things at the federal level. Now the focus of the book is a little bit more toward what can be done locally, but there still are some things that, happen at the federal level. So the first one is the investment tax credit. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. Then state mandates or incentives, so most of you know about the regional portfolio standards and Colorado's goals. Statewide permitting is one thing that I'm proposing because I'm seeing a lot of variation and that's creating a lot of cost and problems. I always think it's sort of interesting that the Oil and gas companies say they can't possibly have different rules in Longmont or Boulder for fracking because they have to have uniformity statewide and they have to have the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission there to protect their rights. But wind and solar, they have to deal with every local neighborhood, and they don't have any oil and gas conservation. They don't have no state commission to take care of them. And so, you know, whether these state commissions are unpopular enough, at least to level the playing field, you might want to have some kind of statewide regulation. Then standardizing the codes, because I have talked to, you know, installers, and they just say there's so many codes that it's really difficult to keep up with, and then, you know, the keeping up with some of those codes are super protective too, and maybe overprotective for solar as opposed to, you know, natural gas, which just blew up somebody's house and is always, you know, several deaths every year on natural gas. And then utility rate designs, I talked a little bit about time of use, and then what some of the local communities are doing. So here's just a quick, the investment tax credit in one slide is saying that what happened in December of 2015, the Congress agreed to extend the investment tax credit. It's different for wind, that's a production tax credit, but that one got extended too for a short period, but they're all phasing down. So solar is staying at 30%, so if you install solar panels, you can get tax refund of 30%. Until 2019, and then at 2020 it's going to go to 26%, 2012, 22%, and then for residential homeowners it goes away. For commercial, they get a continuing 10%, okay? So it will be interesting to see how the industry might be hurt by that with wind, because the production tax credit changed this year. There was a huge flurry of people trying to get something in the ground before the end of 2016 so they could, you know, claim that tax credit. So we'll see if there's a flurry in solar as this changes. But the concept is that, well, you know, they're going to be price competitive. They don't need this tax advantage. Then state mandates or incentives. So, you know, still saying we need to have renewable portfolio standards. The states have really driven renewable energy in the United States, because, you know, some of this started back under the Bush administration. There wasn't anything happening at the federal level, so states stepped up, and really a lot of renewables have been installed at the state because of these state mandates. And then there have been some activities with the renewable portfolio standards. The green means that they've increased the standards, then some regulatory increases. So there are only a few places where there were some rollbacks as far as the standards. Ohio, Kansas, is that West Virginia? Yeah. Because there have been, you know, pushback from the Heartland Institute and people like that, ACOR, to get rid of the renewable portfolio standards. So the fact that they're standing up as well as they have, I think, is a testimony to how much people really do want renewable energy. And then sometimes solar is carved out. A certain percent of solar and a certain percent of distributed solar has been in there, so that's helped some solar. And so there's this National Renewable Energy Lab study about the analysis of benefits and impacts of renewable portfolio standard, if anybody's interested in that. And then this is information about storage and what's happening there. I'm not really sure what it means that California's a rainbow. It's a rainbow state. I guess it has a little bit of everything. But, you know, there are more and more states that are beginning to create storage mandates in addition to renewable energy mandates, so that we can try to step that up. Okay, then the next thing is that I said I recommend, or I think it would be helpful to have statewide permitting, because the consistency would really help. Some of you have seen the comparisons with Germany. The price of a solar panel is almost the same in Germany and the United States, and that price keeps going down. But what we have in the United States is what we call soft costs that are really high and variable. You know, I've heard installers say that Dillon is the worst place to install solar in the state of Colorado, because it has so many additional fees, And so, you know, in the United States, there has been a trend toward trying to reduce these soft costs. That was part of the Solar Sunshot Initiative. But in some ways, some of those costs are going back up, some of the balance of system costs, because they'll add, well, now you need to have this automatic shutoff that costs an extra $1,000. That's a significant additional cost to the system. So I think we're still struggling with trying to bring down some of these soft costs. Also, with respect to the codes, you know, installers have to deal with the building codes and the electrical codes, and a lot of times the local governments don't know which one is going to be controlling. I heard, I think that recently in Golden, approval of solar installations moved from the fire department to the building department, and the fire department knew, you know, when you could have a modification of maybe some of the rigid rules. Like they'd say, well, because of your roof, and now we have these rules about pathways on the roof, we're not going to be able to install anything here, or we can only install a much smaller system. And the building department, the fire department might have said, well, we'll make an exception because we know that might work, it's still safe. But the building department was really kind of going by the book. And so there still needs to be some understanding of this, some consistency, and some communication about the issue. And even just, I was told, even just keeping up with all these different, you know, some cities have 1 year of the International Building Code, another location has a different one. So it can be really challenging for installers. And they have to spend a lot of time and extra cost getting up to speed. And I talked a little bit about the utility rate design. So the utilities have been playing with this, but this is a graph from this NREL study just talking about how different rate designs can make your solar system more valuable or less valuable, because it has an impact on how much you're getting back from your system, how much you have to pay the utility. And so it's significant how they set up their rates. And you know, the biggest battle has been over net metering, which means that whatever you generate gets to go back in. And I've been also, you know, getting stories from people in New York State where some of the localities are passing laws that don't allow you to put the electrons generated in your solar panels back into the system. So they're actually, you know, creating a disincentive for any solar in their communities. So when you take away that incentive to get some money back for what you're doing, there are different ways of pricing it. It can be very problematic. So again, this has been a battle that's going on that sort of national groups have been fighting. So, you know, net metering cap increased in California, solar credit as wholesale. So there are different ways they're looking at trying to price solar. Some people talk about the value of solar, so they look at solar at the time that it's being used, that kind of thing. Some people say where we're ultimately going to go when we have smart enough equipment is to transactional energy. So you'll actually be, you know, whenever you sell your energy, we'll be getting it at whatever the price would have been in the market. So if anybody's been in Excel, they have these trading rooms. It's like the stock market. And they're looking at prices and what's being generated here and whether we can buy some over there. But that would actually be sort of happening in your home. And your smart appliances would say, well, we're not going to charge the car now because this is when it's high. Or we will charge the car now because the price is low. Or we'll put our, you know, solar into the system if the price is high. Maybe we'll put it into our batteries if the price is not. So, and, you know, then again, because this area, at least in 2015, 2016, there's still been sort of pushback on net metering and how it's going to be changed or not. And here, right here in Colorado, we just had our big settlement because of that, some of that pushback from XL. And finally, with respect to local action, some of you will recognize Rebecca Cantwell, who's with the COSIA. She's been working on solar-friendly communities, which is trying to get communities to be more, to kind of compete with each other to be more friendly and to get this certification, their different status, so that they, you know, post their requirements. They make life easy. They streamline the processes. They keep permit prices. I heard the Colorado legislature, I think that we passed in this session, that said solar permits will be no more than $500 or something. Does anybody know specifically about that legislation? But that you know, you might say, woohoo, but I mean, Denver only charges $50. So there's still a lot of discretion between one community and another. If somebody's still charging $500 for a solar permit and another community is charging $50, it would be helpful to have, you know, more consistency. So those were the proposals for solar, you know, the killer app of solar and storage. And then I looked at distributed thermal resources, and it seems a lot harder to find information about that, because I think that a lot of people don't have a lot of experience with it. But 37% of CO2 emissions come from commercial and residential buildings combined. The largest contributors are water heating, which is, you know, here for residential, and space heating. Well, actually, space cooling and space heating, right? So your air conditioner, your furnace, that kind of thing. So, and about half of the floor space is currently heated with fossil fuels. So for all the people with gas furnace, that's what you're using. This is a major source of fossil fuel use that we're trying to phase out. So energy efficiency will get rid of some of that, but you still need some kind of heating, and so electrification would help get rid of the fossil fuel use. The International Energy Agency, which is stationed in Paris, has a heating and cooling program, and they say that, you know, they're trying to go with thermal energy. China led with the most gigawatts of thermal energy, and Europe was next. US and Canada only had 18 gigawatts, so we've got a lot less than China. 94% of those were hot water. So, you know, this solar thermal program, there's a lot more potential to use it to heat buildings, but right now, at least a lot of people are using it for hot water. Some are swimming pools, and some are space combined, solar and space heating. Their goal is to try to increase that to 8 times. So much more potential. So looking at domestic hot water in the United States, you know, a lot of people have gas hot water heaters. You could replace that with electric, but if your electricity is being generated by fossil fuels, that's not so good. But there have been some programs where they're using it again to deal with the duct curve, as I talked to you about earlier. You could have a number of hot water heaters that are smart hot water heaters that are part of a demand response. And so if there's solar being generated, then they actually direct it and go put it into the hot water heaters so they can store that energy. The reports that I mentioned earlier pushed heavily for heat pump water heaters because heat pumps are more efficient than you know, either of the other two designs here. And then there's always, of course, the solar thermal, which is what we were talking about. 94% of that world use right now is where you either have the water or some kind of antifreeze fluid in the panels, and then they circulate through the hot water tank. And because residential water heaters have a relatively shorter life than a lot of other improvements, then they're more of a quick fix, right? So we talk about buildings having at least a 50-year lifespan, and, you know, 100 years, some of them. There's more urgency to get efficient buildings right now then, because we're not going to meet the mid-century goal if we don't change those buildings out, or at least improve buildings that are existing. But at least, you know, incandescent light bulbs, you can get rid of those most quickly, and then the hot water heater is sort of the next step as far as trying to get people to quickly change things. Okay, then space conditioning is basically HVAC, right? Your heating and cooling, air conditioning. And this was in the Obama proposal, saying that commercial buildings, residential buildings, these are the winners, these are the losers, 2015 to 2050. And so what you notice is that with the plan to decarbonize, we have some technologies that we're not really using very much right now. So one of those is this heat pump space and water heating, as I mentioned before, that you don't even see that hardly in this column. And you want more high efficiency air conditioning, but trying to go more to heat pumps for space conditioning. So some of the heat pumps that you may have heard of, they use thermodynamics instead of burning fuel. So this one just shows that, you know, they can be used for both heating and cooling. So the BTUs go out in the summer, you pump the heat out of the building and the ground is cooler. So you're bringing cool air in. But in winter, you actually, you know, can get more warmth out of the ground, and so the BTUs go in. And they, as I said, they're about a third of the cost of conventional equipment for heating. The US was leading in the world for ground source heat pumps. In 2004, we had about 65%, but by 2009, other countries had gotten ahead and we'd lost some of that lead. So there are a lot of issues with ground source heat pumps because, especially if you're going to be digging things in the ground, then you often need a drilling permit. Some jurisdictions have different requirements. You worry about, sometimes they put these coils out into a lake, so that's not particularly good, right? Because it's changing the water temperature and it has some impacts that could potentially pollute a water source. So, you know, how they're executed is important. Then the combi solar thermal systems, they use a solar collector. The warmed water goes into the tank. Some of that's used for hot water, domestic hot water. Some of it can be used for space heating. So it's a combined system. They can provide 100% of your heating and cooling needs in your domestic hot water. And Laurent, I don't think he's here tonight, but many of you know Laurent Million, who does a lot of these systems. And then district heating is something that we don't use so much in the United States, but in Europe, especially Denmark, they do a lot of this. They have a central plant where the heat is generated, and then there are pipes that go to different, you know, buildings. And in conventionally, like in Boise, Idaho, they have geothermal to heat everything, and then the pipes go from one building to another. In Denmark, they were using biofuels, so they were burning, you know, they're still burning something, but they were creating this heat that they pumped right around, sometimes through hot water heat. This system is one that's set up in Alberta, Canada, and they're using solar thermal panels to collect heat, and they have a borehole. So they have, you know, sort of a ground source storage area for that as well. And then they can create this loop for heating throughout the whole development. And some of you know Norbert, I don't think he's here either, but, oh, there he is. You're doing that with your GEOS project, not solar thermal. You're not storing it, but you're getting the ground source. Yeah. So, see, there are innovative people that are doing this, and I'd love to have him say more in a minute if he's interested. So, you know, the final step here is the legal pathways for these thermal systems. The investment tax credit, as I showed you in the previous slide, you know, is going to be there 30% until 2021. And then it steps down and then it goes away. But at least it will cover the PV and the solar thermal technologies. But residential energy efficiency tax credit expired at the end of last year. So that means, you know, electric heat pump water heaters, air and ground source heat pumps, they're not going to be getting those tax advantages anymore. So, you know, I don't know that we're going to be able to get that through Congress to extend that, but it's too bad because that's now, you know, put those systems at a disadvantage with respect to other systems. So. And they also require pretty high initial investment, so it's going to be difficult for them to take off without those incentives. So that's something that, you know, I would recommend at the federal level. We'll see whether that's something that we could get through at the federal level. At the state level, renewable portfolio standards a lot of times don't include thermal heating. So 7 of 31 jurisdictions don't do it, and I think that we've been trying to get legislation in Colorado that would include thermal in our renewable portfolio standard and it happened a lot because initially the renewable portfolio standards were replacing electricity, and especially in a state like Colorado, again, I don't know politically whether we could get that passed because natural gas is our main source of hot water, and natural gas is cheap in Colorado, and we've got definitely lobbying groups in Colorado that would not want to have that be replaced, but at least for decarbonization, that would be the way you would want to try to have it move, that there were some incentives to switch. And Hawaii and some other states have done that. Hawaii doesn't have cheap natural gas. Hawaii has adopted a statute that mandates every single family dwelling have a solar water heating system, and I think Hawaii's is a pretty good model because it doesn't say it has to be solar hot water, solar thermal. It could be solar PV matched with, an electric water tank. So, that flexibility is good for whichever works in the jurisdiction you're in. And then New York has some incentives for solar thermal technologies. Then similar to the solar PV thing, I think standardized permitting would help with these thermal systems because it's very difficult. It's confusing. They don't know if they have to get a drilling permit. They don't know what kind of water permits they need. They're different parts. Some towns would not require a license or a permit. More often, though, a license is required, and so some of the permitting can cost up to 20% of what the system would require. And this is something that Laurent was pointing out to me with his solar thermal systems, is that, for instance, if you put in a natural gas hot water heater in Boulder, you just go to the counter and they just stamp it right there, right? And those are much more dangerous than what he's trying to do with solar thermal hot water, and he can't get the permit. They delay, they require diagrams, they say, we need all this other stuff. And so it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it's just that, this newer technology is like the red flag rule, is that they don't know it, it's not standard. The gas is standard, so they're going to keep going. But I think educating communities that care about this, obviously Boulder does, would probably help. And so that's why I'm arguing for standardization. Then the last two things are building standards for ground source heat pumps and district heating. The building codes sometimes cause some issues for them because they're inconsistent. And then sometimes utility rates that seem well-meaning, that are like, rates that are tiered, so once you spend more money for electricity, you're going to pay a higher rate. Well, those are a disadvantage for ground source heat pumps or just heat pumps because they're electric heat pumps. They're actually cutting back on carbon, but they may be using more electricity than a natural gas, because a lot of times, when you're calculating, whenever people ask us about our house, we always make sure they know our total energy use is this, because we don't have a gas furnace. We don't have any gas in our house. And so when we're being compared to someone else and someone compares us with, Excel's average electricity use, we go, that doesn't represent that's not a good comparison for us, because ours should be compared to the electricity use and the natural gas use, because as I pointed out before, up to 3/4 of that could have been natural gas. So that's what they're saying here too, is that, if people switch to electricity, there need to be electricity rates maybe that reflect that you're not using a fossil fuel if you're trying to decarbonize. So how many people have seen this picture? Anybody seen that? A couple of people. This is when Pope Francis became the Pope, everybody had their cell phones up and their computers, but this is from 2005, so just 8 years before when the previous Pope, actually before Benedict. I think this is supposed to be the funeral, but it's around when Benedict became the Pope. You only see a couple of phones. And so, disruptive technologies are going to come through fast, but, cell phones actually got some push from the federal government. There's a federal statute that says local authorities can't stop you from putting up cell phone towers because there was pushback from communities. So renewable energies, have these problems because, as I said, in New York now they're saying we don't like how solar panels look, so we're going to limit how big the arrays can be, or we don't like wind turbines. And actually, I think I just saw Maine said that, you have to get aesthetic approval before you put a wind turbine up. So the only way they can block them, because they don't blow up and they don't cause all these other problems, is to say, well, we don't like how they look. But cell phones, people didn't like how the towers look, but then we got this Federal Communications Act that said, well, local authorities can do some things, but they can't prevent you from putting it up. So it'd be nice to have that federal push to help renewables as well. And the last talk here was about autonomous cars, and we were talking about how we're kind of in these early phases where some of the functions are automated, but we're not at full self-driving. And the wisdom of most lawyers is that it's going to be a really long time before we get to that last stage because of the legal implications, right? Because right now, a driver is responsible for an accident, right? But if it becomes fully autonomous car, then they're going to start suing the automobile companies, right? And so it won't be the driver's fault anymore. It's going to be the automobile companies, and they're not going to like that, right? And then the insurance companies actually don't like that because they're all making a lot of money off of every one of us for our automobile insurance, right? So that hurts the insurance industry. It hurts the automobile industry. So they don't want that shift. There are ethical questions. I don't know if you've seen this, but one of the things is the programming. People don't want to buy an autonomous car that would choose to maybe kill you or your passenger before killing a pedestrian, but how do you program it? Do you want to have it programmed to kill the pedestrian? I don't know. And then the person who did the programming gets sued. We lawyers, they're terrible. And then also, there's a lot of concern about data security. And people have already been able to hack cars. And, the cars are going to have to communicate with each other already. The Department of Transportation is developing standards for them to communicate. And the FCC has dedicated bandwidth for cars to be communicating. But, what happens when somebody gets control of them and who is responsible for that? So I think it's going to be interesting to see. We have this wonderful new technology, but when we get to this final point is going to be, you're going to see a lot of legislation coming through similar to the Communications Act that says automobile manufacturers aren't liable. Things like that. They're going to try to push that through because then the automobile companies say, okay, we'll go that next step as long as you're not making us the ones that have to pay for it. As long as, because they don't want to be responsible. Oh, okay. So yeah, there's legislation that protects them, right? So just to wrap up, my conclusion is, I think new technologies are unstoppable, but they could do it with a little more help from their friends because otherwise we're going to have this period, as we did with the cars, of, the red flag law will be in effect for a few more decades, and because global warming's not slowing down, we can't really afford to wait a few more decades. So that's a wrap up. I'll take questions.